Don Baham, a community access television producer and the host of an ongoing weekly cable television series, Conversations with Dr. Don. I'm also a retired clinical psychologist and a certified Creole, born and raised in New Orleans, Louisiana. The program you're about to watch, one of a series of 16 or so individual broadcasts, came about because I wanted to record and share with you highlights of the 2007 Creole Heritage Celebration in the beautiful and historic city of Natchitoches in northwest Louisiana. I wanted to do this because I'd heard good things about this organization of Creoles from a number of sources. An organization that tracks the Creole diaspora? When I grew up in New Orleans in the 30s and 40s, I knew of no formal organization of Creoles like the Creole Heritage Foundation of today. I only knew of the local, more or less, neighborhood social organizations like the Autocrat Club in New Orleans. Well, like so many young Creoles in the 40s, returning from military service to other parts of the country, I lost touch to a large degree with the New Orleans Creole-style community. Now, the city of Los Angeles Creole community in the 50s through the 70s provided a modicum of Creole community, but nothing like the Creole community in New Orleans in the 30s and 40s. And then moving out of Los Angeles proper into the larger Los Angeles area suburban community further isolated me from my cultural upbringing, not to mention moving to Oregon 13 years ago. Ever find yourself in a place where you see someone that has a look or a flavor about them that suggests that they might be a Creole or whatever, only to discover that it is more how they look physically that caused your misperception? Now, of course, I love where I live now in the rainy Pacific Northwest, but if there are any Creoles up here, I haven't seen any. So that's why I decided that I had to come to the celebration. And I'm so very glad I did. I can't put into words the feelings of joy and connection that I felt at the celebration and am still feeling today. That feeling of joy and connection was certainly encouraged and facilitated by the warm and gracious welcome and ongoing support and assistance of Mrs. Janet Rabare Colson, the Executive Director of the NSU Creole Heritage Center, and her eager, dedicated staff. I can't thank Mrs. Colson and her staff enough. I believe that the flavor and essence of what it's like to be Creole comes through in the speeches and presentations that you will see and hear in the series of broadcasts that comprise the complete program. I believe that whether or not you're a Creole, you're bound to learn more about us, our heritage, and our love of life. I hope that after viewing any or all of this series of programs, you viewers might become encouraged to find more of the fun and love of life in your own particular culture. So, enough of my talk, and on with the program.
ancestry, no matter how genealogically distant, meant that a person was legally black. Both social and economic conditions for Creole people in Louisiana deteriorated radically under Jim Crow, which effectively legalized segregation and led many Creoles to confront a sad reality. Creole social identity and culture was being subsumed under the racial classification of Negro in Louisiana and throughout the South. Landowning, financially secure Albertville residents who formed a strong, bounded community with a deep history were particularly sensitive to increasing social marginalization in the South. Products of parochial schools or community-based Creole schools with Creole teachers, Louisiana Creoles were by and large an educated group of people. If educational opportunities were unavailable within their communities, Creole children were forced to attend Negro schools primarily housed in black Protestant churches, which was an unacceptable situation for the fiercely Catholic Creoles. Educational segregation, lack of access to professional services like hospitals and doctors, social marginalization, and political powerlessness caused many Creole veterans to move out of the state after World War I. Probably more Louisiana Creoles would have relocated between World War I and World War II had not the Great Depression eliminated jobs, impacted trades, and limited mobility nationwide, sending many Creole families back to family farms. Ironically, as jobs in urban centers were lost during the Depression, agricultural production in Louisiana increased markedly, and farming was once again a viable way of life. The growing unrest in Western Europe and the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor prompted many young Creoles to enlist in military service. Associated war industries developed in California, affording new and exciting employment opportunities as well. Creole outmigration from Louisiana increased after World War II, with 1946 being a watershed year in the burgeoning California Creole colony. Creoles who settled in California in the initial wave of migration brokered for relatives and friends from Louisiana who joined them in a more colorblind society. A man or a young couple would establish themselves in a city like Los Angeles, find work, and send financial support home to parents or siblings, often paying taxes on ancestral land so that they remained in the family. Leasing their Louisiana farmland to big farmers was one option to maintain ownership when owners were living elsewhere. Compounding the migration trend were the changes in agricultural production in the South as mechanized cotton farming became the norm and did away with the need for so many human hands. In the 30 years after World War II, the social landscape of the South, and especially in communities like Albertville, was irrevocably altered. Sister Frances Jerome Woods, a nun working in the community in the 1960s and 70s, noted at that time that almost 80% of the living Creoles who had been born at Albertville had moved away to urban centers like New Orleans, Chicago, Houston, and Los Angeles. Creole elders lamented the outflow of population that resulted in the abandonment of land and houses and a general air of stagnation that settled upon the landscape. Louis Matoir, who you heard earlier, editor of the California-based Bayou Talk newspaper, noted in 1906 that a number of Creole families were celebrating over 50 years of residency in California. The surnames of those in that first wave of migration to California are closely associated with and still common to the Albertville community: Matoir, Sarpy, Rachel, Lacaze, Chevalier, Rock, LaCour, Dupree, Conant, and Lawrence, among others. Jim Lawrence, who lives here now, recalled that his family had moved to Shreveport for better employment opportunities, but within a few years they had moved on to California to join a large and successful community there. Creole families in Los Angeles and its environs tended to consolidate into communities around neighborhood Catholic churches, sometimes termed colored Catholic parishes. Creoles moved into housing provided for by friends and relatives who helped them adjust. These transplants maintained close connections to their relatives in Louisiana, however, many sending their children home every summer to places like Albertville so that they could know their Creole roots. Creoles interviewed for this study, regardless of where their Louisiana families originated, identified Albertville Creoles as strong connector families that linked the California communities back to Louisiana. The Albertville community still exists after more than 200 years on most of the original 18,000-acre land grants from which it originated. Community leader Terrell Delphin suggests that the Albertville community is such a touchstone for Louisiana Creole culture and identity because that community is not surrounded by Cajun communities in southwestern Louisiana like a lot of other Creole communities are. Located in northwestern Louisiana, Albertville is the closest Creole community to Marksville, and both of them are linked by the Red River. Louise Rivar Lawrence and Jeanette Rivar Colson, cousins whose families hailed from Marksville, both married men from Albertville. Their stories are typical of the experiences of many California Creoles. Mrs. Lawrence told how her father's siblings all left rural Avoyelles Parish by the time she was an adolescent. But after joining his brothers for a time in California, he got nostalgic for Avoyelles Parish and came back. Mr. Rivar was a tradesman, a mason, and a carpenter, as well as a farmer, so he was not as dependent upon farming to make a living for his family, and he was able to hold out longer in Louisiana than his brothers. One by one, however, as his children grew into young adulthood, each sought better opportunities in California. By the late 1960s, farming had become more difficult and expensive, so Clarence and his wife joined their children and siblings in Los Angeles in order to keep their family together. Louise Lawrence said she never heard the family talk about relocation as a means to escape hardship or social inequities in Louisiana, but instead in a positive way, as a way to increase their opportunities for a better life. No doubt it was better in many ways. Joining relatives already established in and around Los Angeles, they easily found jobs and established businesses. Clarence Rivar, for example, opened a service station. Moreover, Creole women were now afforded new opportunities on the West Coast. Jim Lawrence also recalled a female relative who found work in California and had her own money for the first time. She used this money to buy stylish clothing, shoes, and furnishings. These young women who had seen their female relatives in Louisiana work as domestics and in service industries took great pride in working outside the home in responsible positions and enabling themselves to become self-sufficient. In Los Angeles, Creole neighborhoods developed with their own churches now, parochial schools, and a sense of community. As older communities evolved and ran down, other communities in Los Angeles developed. Louise Lawrence says it was not only a migration to California, but it was a migration from neighborhood to neighborhood in California. This was often a result of increasing affluence in the families. Still, regardless of how geographically distant the Creole communities in California became, a close social network reinforced by marriage and kinship maintained the ties between them. While the Creoles who migrated to California maintained a sense of identity forged in their individual Louisiana communities, after relocation to Los Angeles, a more generic Creole identity evolved. Churches remained the social centers of the Creole communities as they had been in Louisiana. Weddings, funerals, parties, communions, and other social occasions were centered at the churches, and the growing Creole communities were brought closer through these interactions. Education remained a priority. Families struggled financially to send their children to parochial schools, and many young Creoles went to nearby universities in Los Angeles. By the 1980s, Creoles had their own newspaper, Bayou Talk, published by Albertville native Louis Matoyer. Bayou Talk not only kept Louisiana Creoles up on the news in California, but also has and continues to have a great readership all over the nation. It keeps extended families informed about the activities of different Creole colonies. At about the same time, California Creoles began a cross-migration back to Louisiana. Jeanette Rivar married John Colson and joined his family in Natchitoches. Her sister Norma had already married John's cousin, Alvin Matoyer, and relocated to Natchitoches. Their siblings, however, remained and do remain in California. Louise and Jim Lawrence had not returned to Louisiana since their families moved to Los Angeles, but in 1976 they decided to bring their children back on a vacation trip to visit their old homelands. It was the first time that Louise Lawrence had ever visited Albertville, and she and the children were drawn to the quiet rural community, so different from Los Angeles but with so many parallels. St. Augustine Catholic Church was the center of social and spiritual activities, just like the churches in California. Albertville Creoles struggled to send their children to parochial schools just like their relatives in Los Angeles. And Jim Lawrence, whose entire childhood was spent on the West Coast, rediscovered the home of his ancestors, reconnected with his relatives, and a few years later persuaded his wife to return to live in Albertville. Of their 5 children who were born and grew up in California, 3 now also make their homes in Natchitoches Parish. Like many others who returned from extended Creole colonies in Los Angeles and Chicago, Louise Lawrence never thought that she would come back to live in Louisiana. Still, as she observed, things change, situations change, and more we have families coming back home. Many among the first wave of Creoles to migrate to California have retired and returned to ancestral homelands in Louisiana. Their children send their children to home in Louisiana to spend the summers just like their parents did before them. These children often end up finding husbands and wives in Louisiana, which is an enduring practice in the Los Angeles to Louisiana continuum. As Creoles become increasingly a world culture, the bonds between the Louisiana homelands and the California Creole colonies remain linked by a common experience, kinship, and identity. Los Angeles will remain a destination for young Creoles who are seeking opportunities that California provides. The neighborhoods and churches dominated by Louisiana Creoles will remain the islands of interaction in these urban communities. Creole colonies now are forming in Santa Barbara, Las Vegas, and a large colony in Houston and Chicago. They're growing larger and they become more firmly established. But in the end, the rural farms and communities of Louisiana will remain at the heart of Creole culture and identity for Creoles throughout the United States. Thank you. Are there any questions? Oh, I'm sorry. Are there any questions?
How much of a migration of the Creole people ended up in Northern California rather than below Santa Barbara in the Los Angeles area?
When did your family migrate? Can you tell me about what time?
About 42,
About
43.
42. And what was the destination? Why Northern California as opposed to Southern?
My grandfather went out there first,
Okay.
and he was a bricklayer. And I
Okay.
imagine he went out there because of the work, and then suggested that my father move out because of the brickwork and construction being so much better out there.
I'm honestly not sure. You're telling me stuff I don't know. Because I know that Northern California is now a growing Creole community. There's a larger community growing there. But I didn't realize that actually 1942 predates the big migration to Los Angeles. I'd be real interested to talk to you about that.
I just wanted to say that we also moved to California. We're from the Oakland, San Francisco Bay Area, and my parents went there in 42 to work in the shipyards during the war. That's when a lot of them went that way because of work.
Right. Okay.
What's your impression about the impact of Katrina in resettling Creoles from New Orleans back to some of the areas like Lafayette and so forth? I noticed a lot of my friends that grew up in New Orleans have moved back to places where their parents used to live or whatever.
Right. We saw a lot of that during Katrina. At first, within the first year after Katrina, a lot of people who left New Orleans ended up on Albertville and other communities, from which they originated. After about a year, when services and things began to get a little bit more stable in New Orleans, you started to see those people go back. Now, some of them have stayed, and they've stayed they have family lands in these communities. It's an easy transition from one place to another, and they maintain those connections to New Orleans. But a lot of them, especially I've noticed elderly people, have decided that it's a little bit too much to try to move back. They just as soon stay in these rural communities where they feel a little bit more comfortable. And a lot of people that retire here, regardless of what the reason is, a lot of people retire here. A lot of people come back and retire in this area. And not just here, but in Louisiana, in the communities that they originated in. Yes, ma'am.
My question is related to other migrations and patterns of migration. They may not have been in large numbers of New Orleans or Louisiana Creole, sorry, from New Orleans, that occurred in other parts of the country. Do you have any data on that, such as to New York or to Washington, D.C., or to Chicago in the earlier years, back in the early 50s, maybe even late 40s?
Chicago, definitely. Chicago was a destination for a lot of people from the South in general who left rural lands and after mechanized cotton farming especially, because there was the stockyards, there were opportunities for employment in Chicago. I don't know so much about New York, Washington, the East Coast. I really don't know that much about that. I had never talked to anybody whose family had gone there. Yes, ma'am. Oh, Albertville. It's down here. Albertville. It becomes kind of like one word. You know. Albertville, for those of you who are from out of town, is in southern Natchitoches Parish. It's down maybe like 20 miles down Highway 1. It was a Creole community that formed around one family that started out, and then it grew exponentially. The Albertville community is still on 16,000 acres of the original 18,000 acres that was granted through the various families in the Spanish period. That's a tremendous land retention, over 200 and some odd years. It's a real bounded community. It has a really strong church, the St. Augustine Church. It used to have a school, St. Joseph's School, and a lot of the people here in Natchitoches grew up in Albertville. And I live there, but I'm not a native of there, so I would say ask somebody around here about the history of their community. And I think there is a display next door that talks about the history of the community as well. It's a very old and strong community. Any other questions?
I had a question. What is the connection between the Caddo Nation of Oklahoma and the Creole community?
I'm glad you asked
in the Natchitoches
that.
Band of Caddos. Being Caddo, I thought
I was actually getting ready to introduce these guys, and that's what I was going to say. But I'll go ahead and say now. We have two representatives from Caddo Nation from Oklahoma here. The Caddo people used to inhabit this area. Natchitoches is a Caddo word. It means place or people of the pawpaws. Pawpaws are a type of fruit that grows around here. In 1835, the Caddos were forced to leave their ancestral homelands, and these homelands stretch from Natchitoches is about the southern extent, but all the way up Red River into southwestern Arkansas, southeastern Oklahoma, and East Texas. These were Caddo lands, and in 1835, after the Americans took over Louisiana, the Caddo were forced to cede their lands, and written into the cession was a sentence that said the Caddo could never come back to this area, that they were never to come back and live, that they were never to come back and visit. Well, guess what? They're back. They've been back. They've been coming back for a number of years. And to answer your question about the connections, there are several genealogical connections between Caddo Nation and the Creole community at Albertville that we know of. There were at least 4 Caddo women who were matriarchs in the formation of the Creole community. And at one trip when Bobby's grandfather came down, we went to eat at a Creole restaurant, and the woman's nickname is Tata. And so Mr. Lyman looked and he goes, well, that's the Caddo word for sister. And sure enough, she was from the LaCour family, which is a family with Caddo progenitors. And ever since then, when he comes back, he wants to go eat with that Caddo girl. So I want to introduce Robert Cast and Bobby Gonzalez from Caddo Nation of Oklahoma. They're going to talk about their efforts to reconnect Caddo people back down to their original homelands, and to inform not only you about Caddo culture, but to inform their own folks about the sites and the places here in Louisiana that a lot of them will never be able to visit. Yes, ma'am. Uh-huh.
When the Indians were forced to leave, was this part of the Trail of Tears?
It was at the same time as the Trail of Tears. It was not what they call a forced removal, but only in name. It was not a forced removal. It was a land cession. They were forced to cede their lands, to give their lands away for a minimal amount of money, which they were never paid for. And it was a devil's bargain. What happened was they said, you can leave, you can sign this cession, you can, take your money and leave, or basically we'll run you out, we'll, terrorize you, we'll kill you. And so they went to join their relatives just over the line in Texas.